August. I am a student here at Lesley, majoring in psychology. I'm a senior, undergraduate senior, and I'll be graduating in May. And today I'll be presenting on the effects of childhood neglect and the critical importance of attachment. As you can assume, this topic can be very sobering to discuss, so take the chocolate, take care of yourselves, and yeah, here we go. In this presentation, I will be introducing the epidemic of complex trauma and neglect, explaining the attachment theory, styles, and how it's developed, illustrating the effects of neglect on neurological development. It's discussing ineffective standards and treatments, and as well as effective policy and interventions. And lastly, we'll focus on how to solve the problem of reducing cases of neglect and its effects on children. Complex trauma can be defined as chronic caregiver interpersonal trauma that occurs in childhood. The 5 types of complex trauma are physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, witnessing domestic violence, and neglect. Childhood maltreatment and complex trauma are far more common than we'd like to believe. In 2015, there were 4 million referrals made to child authorities alleging maltreatment, which extended to 7.2 million children. 3.4 million of these children's cases warranted investigation, and authorities found that more than 683,000 children were targets of victimization. More than 91% of these children were victimized by their parents, and over 75% had experienced neglect. It is the most common reason for a child's separation from their caregivers, and the most common form of complex trauma and maltreatment. That same year, authorities determined that 1,670 children had died from maltreatment. 77.7% of these child fatalities involved their parents, and 968 of these children had died from neglect. The Children's Bureau has also noticed a sharp increase in child victimization prevalence in recent years. While America's total child population has decreased by 401,000, the national estimate of child victims has increased by 25,000. These numbers alone indicate the seriousness of this epidemic, which is spreading at an alarming rate. Research has found there to be 2 main forms of neglect. Global neglect, which indicates extreme sensory deprivation in more than one domain of sensory experience. For example, deprivation of touch, exposure to light, and exposure to language. And chaotic neglect, which is a far more subtle but insidious form of neglect. And it can be explained as a subtle decrease in developmental opportunities that would allow for full social emotional potential by the absence of necessary caregiver attachments. Okay, this is probably attachment theory, not neglect. One of my favorite all-time topics in psychology, because it's basically the theory of everything. I could genuinely talk about it for hours, but I think I've been able to create a general overview in about 2 slides. I'll call it attachment theory in brief. So here we go. The type of attachment found in a child's relationship to their caregiver shapes a person's development in many ways, including formation of identity, agency, sense of self and other, and affect regulation capacities in long-term ways. It defines how we see the world and ourselves within it. Attachment theory indicates 2 types of attachment: secure versus insecure. Securely attached children were provided with safety, stability, and emotional connection. Because of this, they view the world and other people as relatively secure and thus safe to explore. Insecurely attached children were deprived of safety, stability, and emotional connection. As such, they view the world and other people as dangerous and unsafe to explore. They see themselves as unlovable and distrust that others won't hurt them. They may also find it very difficult to experience emotional intimacy with others. Roughly 60% of the population has one of 3 insecure attachment styles: ambivalent or anxious attachment, which suggests an almost obsessive need for companionship; avoidant attachment, which indicates a sort of refusal to rely on others; and disorganized or dissociated attachment, which suggests both needing and fearing the care of others. In cases of children who have been removed from their caregivers due to abuse and neglect, 85% have insecure attachment styles. An infant's attachment is entirely dependent on the responsiveness of the caregiver. It is both sensitive and reactive to their successes and failures to attune to the child's needs and respond appropriately. Responsive caregivers help to assure proper neurological, socio-emotional, and physical development by providing crucial sensory stimuli, including soothing, warming, feeding, and calming the infant in response to their needs. These experiences develop a healthy communication and bond between the infant and caregiver, and this bond then creates the framework for future relationships and how we socially contextualize feelings about our place in the world. It is through the thousands of times we respond to our crying infant that we help create her healthy capacity to get pleasure from future human connection. Attachment is the foundation for developing other functional capabilities and building resilience. When a child's overwhelming feelings aren't regulated by their caregivers, they must rely on primitive coping skills like aggression, dissociation, and avoidance behaviors, which they continue to use as they age. Now, the strongest, most sensitive, most beautiful, and dangerous muscle in the world, the human brain. Our brains develop from the bottom up, from our least to most complex system structures, starting with systems like our stress response in the autonomic nervous system, and ending with cognition and judgment within the cortex. It is extremely sensitive to our environments at all stages of development. Construction is activated by the release of specific neurochemicals, many of which are triggered by physical and emotional connection to our caregivers, such as dopamine and oxytocin. If these chemicals aren't released, development will be disrupted in potentially catastrophic ways. Our brains also develop in a use-dependent manner. Lack of activity can lead to underdeveloped structures in the brain. This can also often be caused by overactivity in another portion of the brain. For instance, children who are neglected will often experience chronic hyperarousal of their stress response system. Since their sympathetic nervous system, which signals to the brain that there's a threat to survival, is constantly active, their parasympathetic nervous system, which signals to the brain that the threat is gone, is underdeveloped. Thus, as the child ages, they will have a limited ability to regulate their arousal in response to fear, regardless of whether a threat is actually present. Fair warning, the images on the next 3 slides can be quite disturbing. Jeannie Wiley, nicknamed the feral child, is one of the most famous and most severe cases of abuse and neglect that has ever been recorded. She was locked alone in a room by her father from 20 months to 13 years old. The room was extremely dark. She spent 13 hours every day strapped onto a child's toilet with a makeshift harness. At night, she was tied into her sleeping bag in her crib with a metal cover, although sometimes she was left on the toilet overnight. She was never exposed to language. Her father abused her mother and brother in other ways and forbid them from speaking to her or from talking outside her room. If Jeannie made noise, her father would beat her, scratch her, and growl like an animal outside her room. She was never held. When she was rescued in 1970, her symptoms were severe. Although she had normal vision, she was unable to focus her eyes more than 10 feet in front of her, which were the dimensions of her room. Her motor skills were extremely weak. She couldn't straighten her limbs, and she developed a bunny walk with her hands held up like paws. She was unable to recognize her form attachments with staff members, her mother, or her brother. She was completely unable to process verbal communication. She could understand her name, but could only say 2 phrases: "Stop it," and "no more." Because Jeannie was never spoken to during early development, her brain couldn't develop the necessary structure to produce language in the cortex. While she was exposed to language at a later age, she was never able to learn language structure. Over time, she learned how to say many words, with speech therapy, but could never understand the nuances in grammatical structures that are essential for functional verbal communication. Jeannie's story is a prime and harrowing example of the brain's use-dependent development. Developmental deficits are increased the earlier and more severe the neglect is. Global neglect will appear in very visible areas, like head size, which can be dramatically small compared to other children the same age. And physiology. Their bodies can be shockingly small. They may be unable to process nutrients and labeled as failure to thrive. Jason Lopez was rescued from his caregivers in 2008. He was globally neglected, deprived of physical touch, emotional connection, and language and light exposure. At the time of his rescue, he was 9 years old, but he weighed less than 18 pounds, the size of an average 2-year-old. Neglected children also have slow neuron communication or brain processing speed from weak and non-complex dendrite formation, limited synaptic sculpting, and decreased myelination, terms that only the science nerds in the room will probably know. But it also impairs language development and attention capacity, increases impulsivity and hypoarousal, and distorts one's sense of self and others. For many children who experience chaotic neglect, its impact is most noticeable in their emotional and social capacities. Children will lack the ability to regulate their emotions. They experience dysphoric, negative, and irritable emotions, and anhedonic numbness to pleasure. Their difficulty in relating to others results from a decrease or lack of empathy. This can be pathological and potentially result in conduct disorder, which can become antisocial personality disorder or sociopathy in adulthood. Developing empathy is experience-based and activity-dependent. If they don't witness or receive empathy, they don't have the opportunity to develop it. When an infant is consistently not comforted in response to their cries, they stop crying altogether. They've learned through experience that crying is useless in getting what they need. They've also learned that they are alone and cannot trust or rely on others. Lastly, neglect also appears in a child's behavior. Many exhibit hyperactivity or sluggishness, attention-seeking behaviors or withdrawn behaviors, impulsivity, an overfamiliarity with strangers and willingness to go off with them, as in disinhibited social engagement disorder, which puts them at a high risk for abduction, and even violence in conduct disorders. Many of our society's current policies and treatments are ineffective in caring for and protecting these children. Child welfare services have limited standards for routine screening for trauma exposure and traumatic stress, and don't account for source to explain a child's symptoms. Because of this, they can't make accurate recommendations for trauma-specific treatments and services. It can also lead to misdiagnosis. Complex trauma symptoms can often look like ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, anxiety disorders, depression, and even autism. Many children with untreated trauma symptoms can be difficult to care for, but instead of getting proper treatment, they are often bounced around to numerous foster homes. Of course, this only worsens their symptoms, as they're continuously re-traumatized by caregiver abandonment. They're passed off to home after home until they eventually age out of the system. Unfortunately, neglect may be the most destructive, yet empirically ignored form of child maltreatment. Variability in symptom presentations creates a lack of initiative in tackling more complex forms of empirical research. The most severe cases go unstudied and aren't helped by standard treatment services. It's also fueled by ignorance of how significantly neurodevelopment is impaired by early abuse and neglect, with the popular inaccurate assumption that all children are innately resilient. In a more generalized way, our society also overlooks the unique impact of a traumatic experience on one's life, through fracturing their mental health, general functioning, and relationships with others. Even Leslie is guilty of this neglect. Not trying to hate on my school, because I really love it here, but like, I need to turn the attention to this for a moment. When I was submitting my proposal for the presentation, I had to choose categories that would describe the kind of topics my presentation would be covering, such as psychology, mental illness within psychology, social psychology, etc. There must have been close to 1,000 categories, subcategories, sub-subcategories, and sub-sub-subcategories on the list. But the only mention of trauma was in terms of physical trauma. As Leslie is, in my experience, an inclusive environment for learning, I was shocked to find no mention of psychological trauma on the list. It revealed to me that this systemic neglecting of neglect does not exclude based on progressive intentions. It's embedded in our culture, our institutions, and our minds. CBT. If anyone knows me very well in the room, you've probably heard me rant about CBT before. Currently, one of the most popular treatment recommendations for PTSD is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. This evidence-based treatment is primarily studied on non-complex PTSD, yet is assumed effective in treating complex trauma. CBT practices cognitive strategies to reduce symptoms, which are ineffective in treating impaired functioning in the beneath the cortex, such as an overactive amygdala, which is the core of the brain's stress response system and chronically overactive in many complex trauma cases. CBT focuses on symptom reduction while invalidating and ignoring emotional experience. It's learning to control symptoms without processing the trauma at the heart of the symptoms. While research produces high clinician-reported symptom reduction, it also produces high participant dropout rates of 41%, which they hide by adding new participants to the study to maintain overall effect size. It's a whole cover-up. Their studies also have many sample exclusion criteria, including use of medications that affect the autonomic nervous system, dissociative identity disorder, dual diagnosis with a substance use disorder, current or recent suicidality, and women in domestic violence relationships, all of which are highly prevalent comorbidities in complex trauma. Therapists often lack compassion and discourage reflection on trauma memories, which has been found to be one of the most essential factors in trauma recovery. Because CBT shows quick initial efficacy in reducing symptoms, it's granted more research funding. However, this doesn't mean it's more effective than complex trauma-specific treatments that have been less empirically studied. The lack of evidence is not an indicator that particular approaches do not work, only that they have not been rigorously tested. So let's explore some of these underrepresented approaches. The ARC framework is a flexible model that's based on the effects of trauma on attachment, self-regulation, and developmental competencies. It's intended to build resilience in the traumatized child. It emphasizes that attachment must be established before moving on to self-regulation and competencies, both of which are impossible to successfully build without a sense of security and stability in the world. ARC therapists focus on increasing caregiver-child attunement to respond to the child's affect rather than their behavior. Research suggests that complex trauma may be best treated from bottom-up and body-based treatments, rather than top-down cognitive treatments like CBT. Bruce Perry and his team at the Child Trauma Academy developed the neurosequential model of therapeutics, my personal favorite, which tailors treatment to the developmental period at which the trauma began. It targets its methods on developing the underdeveloped brain structure before advancing to the next and the next until the cortex is complete. For example, if a young adolescent was physically neglected during infancy, the treatment might begin with a focus on the autonomic nervous system through positive touch in order to reduce sensory hyperarousal. Get smart. Sensory motor arousal regulation treatment, or SMART, aims to achieve somatic regulation through embodied attunement to oneself and others. It helps kids maintain their arousal within their window of tolerance by using physical activity to regulate sensory arousal and channel their energy into productive patterns, which in turn reduces acting out and the need for caregiver and teacher discipline. SMART focuses on reducing a child's behavioral problems with a more person-centered, compassionate approach than CBT. Beyond treatment, child welfare services need to instate better assessment policies, including routine screening procedures for neglect and other forms of trauma, informed treatment recommendations, and consistency and continuity of care. The foster care system must also adjust their process to ensure good quality of its foster homes and caregivers. Children need to be placed in homes with attentive and nurturing caregivers with whom the child can develop secure attachment. Research shows that these children have overall better physical, emotional, and cognitive outcomes. IQ has even been found to increase by 40 points. Now, these are some great steps toward healing neglected children, but they don't get to the heart of the problem, which is preventing more children from experiencing neglect. Community outreach for parent education on the importance of infant attachment and responsiveness could be vitally important for at-risk parents, such as those with early or unexpected pregnancies, adults with minimal education or previous child care exposure, and impoverished families. Investing in early childhood programs for at-risk youth has proved to be dramatically financially beneficial. For every $1 invested in the programs, there are between $4 and $9 in returns, with reduced crime costs, lower special education and welfare costs, and better income tax. Research has found that children from other cultures who are raised in close-knit communities have stronger genetic potential for socio-emotional functioning than children who are raised in our isolated, compartmentalized American society. Encouraging community raising of children can expose them to more consistent socialization, with more exposure to children and adults outside the family and creating an active network of care. Child care programs need to be more accessible to impoverished families who can't afford the high prices of many daycare centers, or have jobs with work hours that prevent them from picking up their children in the middle of the afternoon. These centers also need lower child-to-adult ratios. In Kentucky, for example, the child care center regulations for child-to-adult ratios is incredibly high. Only one staff member is hired to care for every 5 infants, 10 2 to 3-year-olds, 15 5 to 7-year-olds, and 25 children over 7 years old. Incidentally, Kentucky also has one of the highest rates of childhood maltreatment referrals in the US, for nearly 1 in every 10 children. To put this in perspective, Massachusetts, the child care regulation for 1 staff member for every 3 infants and 12 children between 4 and 6 years old is a much smaller ratio that is more encouraged by research. Our state also has a significantly lower rate of maltreatment referrals, 5.8 in 100 children. What does that mean? Does Kentucky just breed cruelty? I mean, I guess that depends on who you ask. But I think we can find our answer in the economy. Massachusetts' poverty rating is 10.4%, making it one of 10 states in the country with a rating below 11%, while Kentucky's rating is 17.2, the 5th highest in the country. All of these numbers, when put together, indicate the statistical reality that it often isn't only the fault of the parents in many neglect cases. It's a much larger systemic issue based on low standards for childcare, low funding for childcare and education programs, and severe economic poverty. In the end, societal awareness of neglect and how systemic oppression is seriously harming our children is the most powerful essential for ending this epidemic. And that, my friends, is possible with help from all of you. Thank you.